Nelson Chamisa is campaigning to become Zimbabwe's next president. His Citizens Coalition for Change party is not even a year old, but in recent by-elections it won an impressive 19 of 28 contested parliamentary seats. That's got people here excited for the upcoming general elections in August. Both the parliament and presidency are up for grabs. The CCC believes it can unseat the ruling ZANU-PF party and its 80-year-old leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa. ZANU-PF has governed Zimbabwe since the end of white minority rule 43 years ago. But in recent decades, the economy has been crippled by mismanagement and international sanctions. Mnangagwa was elected president in 2017, shortly after his predecessor and longtime leader Robert Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. Mnangagwa campaigned on promises to revive the economy, but so far he's failed to deliver. His 45-year-old rival Nelson Chamisa, a trained lawyer and pastor, is now riding a wave of discontent with the status quo. Human rights groups say the upcoming elections will be neither free nor fair. They point to the government's growing crackdown on critics that has included intimidation and arrests. Despite that, the CCC's national spokesperson says her party's on track to make electoral history. The InnerView speaks to Fadzayi Mahere to understand why she's so confident Zimbabwe is about to have a new government. Basil Rahan, TRT World.
She is an advocate, an activist, and the main spokesperson, the national spokesperson for the main opposition, CCC, the Citizens Coalition for Change in Zimbabwe. Fadzayi Mahere, good to have you on the InnerView. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. All things considered, thank you very much for having me, and warm greetings to the viewers.
Tell me, what's the problem with Zimbabwe?
Well, Zimbabwe is a beautiful country, as we all know. It was famously described by Julius Nyerere as the jewel of Africa. However, what's taken Zimbabwe back several years is a leadership crisis. We have had 43 years of misrule, bad governance, dictatorship under ZANU-PF, which was led previously by Robert Mugabe, but was taken over by dictatorship far worse than Robert Mugabe under Mr. Mnangagwa. And that is the problem. Zimbabwe has now become an outpost of tyranny. Political freedoms have been shrunk significantly. We've got political prisoners. We've got all sorts of repressive legislation, violations of the constitution, record-breaking extreme poverty. 49% of the population are currently living under extreme poverty, and a hyperinflation rate of over 700%, the highest in the world, and the highest food inflation rate in the world. So all of it comes together to make a very toxic mix that's caused mass suffering for the people.
Yeah, I tell you what, Zimbabwe is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to in my life. And Zimbabweans are among the most wonderful people one could ever encounter. And it is sad that Zimbabweans have been suffering for so long. So, would you define the historical timeline as there was liberation, but then not quite in practice? And that was 43 years ago. And then, 5 years ago, Zimbabweans felt, 6 years ago, Zimbabweans felt a sense of liberation post-Mugabe. Then again, not quite. So what are you going to do? How do Zimbabweans get out of this cycle where they suspect that change is on the horizon only to be betrayed by the politicians?
I think there is, it's no surprise that the only way we can bring about true democracy to Zimbabwe is to have a free, fair, credible election where every single vote is counted and matters, and the will of the people is given true expression. I think the problems in the previous years has been this failure by political elites to listen to the people and to put citizens at the center of all governance and decision making. And I think what's going to be different this year is that the Citizens Coalition for Change presents a real, credible alternative, an alternative that puts dignity, freedom, prosperity, sound governance, ethical leadership, competence at the forefront of the values that would permeate our style of leadership. And that's what the people need. Zimbabwe has got all the ingredients of success. The only thing that's missing is leaders who actually care about the people. Mm-hmm. And I think in all the previous times, one thing that's consistent is ZANU-PF has always been at the center of it. And I think ZANU-PF, unfortunately, it does not have the capacity as a political movement to put the people first. Their governance style is characterized by patronage, looting, putting forward the interests of a few political elites. So all the natural resources, the gold, the lithium, all the natural resources and minerals Zimbabwe has have been looted effectively by ZANU-PF elites who fail to plow back into basic services such as public health, public education, modernizing the infrastructure, and all of that has resulted in what we have today. And the people have simply had enough. As citizens are saying very unequivocally that in 2023, this year in August, and it's going to be the 23rd of August, 2023, we're going to complete the mission. We can't just have a veil of liberation that is not tied with economic freedom. Zimbabweans have not had economic freedom where the rich, the wealth of the nation is actually enjoyed by the masses. And so we do really need a government that can create an ecosystem where every citizen can thrive, where there's upward mobility, where jobs can be created, where education is properly funded, quality education.
Right.
There's affordable quality healthcare, and you can't have 5 million Zimbabweans who are operating as economic migrants outside the country in our diaspora because of the faith.
And Fadzayi, I guess, let me ask you quite bluntly, why should Zimbabweans trust Mr. Chamisa to be at the wheel and not loot? Not loot from the gold, the resources, the lithium. There's a lithium bonanza. A lot of people excited, a lot of people fearful that this is just going to be more theft. Why should they trust the opposition?
Well, there are a number of reasons why Zimbabweans can and are willing and ready to trust President Nelson Chamisa. And the first one is that he's got a clear record of service. You recall in 2013, where Zimbabwe had a government of national unity, he was one of the youngest members of cabinet as the Minister for ICT, and he delivered on a host of issues, including ensuring better access in terms of education to technological support, ensuring widespread internet penetration, including in rural areas. He participated in various initiatives to uplift communities and to improve communications and telecommunications in this country, which is quite a technical area. And not once was, in that 5-year period, was he plagued by any scandal. He does not have any scandals behind him. All you have is a clean record of service. And you'll also see from President Nelson Chamisa is consistency. Since 1999, where the democratic movement was formed, he's been at the center of it. He's been participating. Whether as a young person, whether as an organizer, whether as a spokesperson, he's always had at his heart this need, or he's participated in the struggle for a better Zimbabwe. But even more fundamentally than that, the kind of leader that's required right now in Zimbabwe, someone who is principled, who's got a clear value system, someone who's got a record of being amongst the people, of listening to the people, being resilient, being strong. He's mounted a very solid global advocacy campaign where he's mobilized SADC leaders across, the...
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to ask about the sense of unity among the opposition. Because 5 years ago, Nelson Chamisa lost the election as the head of the MDC. Now, from the outside looking in, it was a situation over almost 2 decades where the Zimbabwean political battle was Robert Mugabe versus Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC, right? The late Morgan Tsvangirai. After
Yes.
Tsvangirai, 5 years ago, so you've had the MDC T, A, N, multiple offshoots of the MDC. But we've had Chamisa, who ran 5 years ago and lost to Mnangagwa when he seemingly had the whole coalition of the MDC. And now he's the head of a political party that's a splinter of that coalition. So how is it possible to win the election now when he possibly had more political support 5 years ago?
Well, it's important to state that the Triple C is not a splinter of the MDC. It's a brand new movement altogether.
You're
And
derived
everyone,
out of the MDC, true?
No, just formed altogether afresh.
You were,
so,
all,
for
you
example,
were all from the MDC?
No, not everyone is from the MDC. It's a broad tent, and it's a brand new political party that was formed on the 24th of January 2022. And it's no secret, anyone who's familiar with the recent history of Zimbabwe will be aware of ZANU-PF's attempt to infiltrate the real opposition and try and render Zimbabwe a one-party state. They tried to create puppets of the opposition, and what President Nelson Chamisa said very clearly is, I'm not going to be a puppet of ZANU-PF. So if ZANU-PF wants to capture the MDCT, I'm going to start something brand new. And he did. And an overwhelming support of citizens backed him. And beyond the MDCT, you'll recall that there were a series of by-elections last year in 2022. There were over 200 by-elections, and the Citizens Coalition for Change won the majority of them. What you call the MDC won 0.
Right.
ZANU-PF won a minority. What does that tell us? It tells us that the trajectory for the Citizens Coalition for Change is an extremely positive one. And that's the basis of which we're entering this election. Not just that, there have been a lot of empirical surveys independently done. The first one being the Afrobarometer report, which said that if a snap election were to be held, President Nelson Chamisa would win over Mr. Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF.
Yeah, the pollsters are saying that, yeah, you're likely to win according to the pollsters, and I read that, and that's interesting. And you're very optimistic, and I want to run with that for the moment. You sound very optimistic. You sound very optimistic, and I wonder, in a weird roundabout way, do you have to give credit to ZANU-PF and President Emmerson Mnangagwa because you have the optimism of somebody who feels they're going to compete in a free and fair election and win? So do you have to give them credit that this is going to be free and fair?
Absolutely not. And if you look at how the by-elections were conducted, we won despite the odds. The deputy leader of ZANU-PF, just after our formation, said that the Triple C must be crushed like lice. At one of our rallies in Kwekwe, our members were beaten, stoned. One of them actually died at that rally, beaten by thugs of ZANU-PF. We've got More Blessing Ali, one of our activists, who was also killed by ZANU-PF. Currently, we've got political prisoners languishing in prison, because of ZANU-PF, which continues not only to ban our internal meetings, ban our campaigns, ban our rallies, abusing the police service to arrest us on frivolous charges. I mean, if you've read my case, for example, arrested, convicted for a tweet.
Yeah, let's talk a bit more. Okay, so you say unfair. You say unfair playing field. Yeah, you say unfair playing fields. Sure. Finish your point. Finish your point. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Please. You'll see that the terrain is nothing but, completely unfree, and it's not fair either. And you'll see that even the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has, we say, given the voters' roll to ZANU-PF, failed to give the voters' roll to the Triple C. That doesn't bode well for a free and fair election. Not to mention the repressive legislation. You'll know about the Patriotic Act that's about to be enacted. We've got undesirable organizations legislation and a number of other repressive laws that have been enacted by Mr. Mnangagwa to try and thwart the Triple C. So there's no way anyone who's looking at the situation objectively can say we should thank ZANU-PF. If anything, the Triple C is managing to win and to overcome despite the odds, because we've constantly had to change strategy, to maneuver, to make sure that our strategies are not obvious to our opponents so that we overcome, because that's how you have to operate if you're going to beat a sophisticated, tyrannical dictatorship.
Okay, point well taken. You believe that
Thank
you're
you.
going to win in spite of the fact that this is an unlevel playing field. You mentioned your particular situation, and you spent some time in prison. Tell me a little bit about that first. Tell us a little bit about that experience. And I also want our viewers to get to know you a little bit more intimately. So firstly, tell us about that experience.
So I think the first thing to note is that the political charges that were leveled against me aren't something unique. It's part of a pattern of conduct by ZANU-PF, where wherever they believe that there's a prominent opposition figure, they nail them with some sort of flimsy, trumped up charges. The same thing happened to Tendai Biti, to Gladys Klatshwayo, Job Sikala, Jacob Garivume, Hobul Chingono. I mean, I could list a series of government critics, opponents, journalists who faced the same trials. And you'll also find that, you know, a lot of the punishment, and this was pre-trial incarceration, was in our prisons, which are in a deplorable state. No access to water, no toilets in the cells, overcrowding in the prisons, disease all over the place, the plague, COVID. In fact, one of our activists just this weekend contracted COVID after he was also arrested on bogus charges when he took issue with some of the conduct by the Electoral Commission. So, you know, all of this was obviously unconstitutional, and we are challenging it in court. It resulted in me being convicted on the 5th of April, something which is utterly surprising. I mean, the Constitution is very clear that every person has the right to free speech, free conscience, and the tweet was about condemning police brutality, which had been captured on video. You know, why should a citizen be persecuted for condemning the disproportionate use of force by a police officer? I mean, it's simply unheard of. It's only in a dictatorship where that happens. And the potential sentence for this offense was 20 years. You know, that's something that we hear in the worst dictatorships, that someone can potentially go to prison for 20 years. So that sort of thing should never happen.
You paid $500. Is it done and dusted now? Is it over
No,
with?
it's not done and dusted. It's not done and dusted. There's currently both an appeal and a review pending before the High Court. So we're just waiting the outcome of that, and then we'll take things forward. But one thing that I can make abundantly clear is that no amount of persecution, intimidation, harassment, weaponization of the law against us is going to stop us from standing up to ZANU-PF. You know, courage requires us to stand up for what is right, both for our nation, for the citizens, and also for future generations. We just want a Zimbabwe that works for everyone, not just a few.
Fadzayi, do you regret the tweet in any way, shape, or form?
Not. I stand by it, and I was very clear. I mean, the state, the police were going to have a very difficult time trying to prove that I was the one who tweeted that, but I stood by it and I said, look, this is an admission I'm willing to make, because no way, you know, it should never be acceptable in a constitutional democracy for the police to harm, to use so much violence that a baby is harmed.
So yeah, just for clarity, right? So there was a fracas, a video, a woman seen with a baby that looked somewhat limp, but we can't be sure. She was grabbing a policeman by the collar. You had tweeted condemning police brutality, but also in linking to the video, you said that the baby was dead. Now the police said the baby was not dead, and the mother and child are okay. So are you, 3 years on, are you certain that the baby was dead, or were they wrong? Have they covered up the death of a child?
Well, the first thing and the most important thing to note in my trial specifically is that the offense with which I was charged in the first place was struck off the statute books in Zimbabwe in 2013. And in fact, months before my case was heard, the High Court had found that, you know, the charges against Hopewell Chingono could not stand because this offense was no longer recognized on our statute books. So it's important to make clear that I was convicted of a non-existent offense. But more fundamentally than that, if you look at the video itself, anyone who's watched it sees that all the eyewitnesses and bystanders are saying the baby has died. The policeman killed a baby. Why did you beat
But do you have any, 3 years on, do you have any clarity on whether the baby is dead or alive? Because I think that's an important point, isn't it?
No, I think the first thing as a matter of law is you listen to the evidence of the bystanders who were there.
Sure,
If they also,
but 3 years on, don't we have clarity? I mean, you said they killed a baby. Aren't you interested in whether the baby's dead or alive?
3 years on, what I know from my trial is that they weren't able to bring any medical officer who attended to the baby. No certificate, no medical evidence which would have proved that this baby died or didn't die. They certainly could not prove that fact. And one thing that's critical in the record of proceedings actually shows is that when the video was played, the mother of the baby started shrieking. She started crying, very loudly wailing. She wailed so loudly that the court had to adjourn the proceedings. So one would have to ask, why was she crying if her baby was fine?
One of the reasons why I ask you is, Fadzayi, is Paul Nyati, who was the assistant commissioner, had put out a statement saying that the baby was fine and the mother was fine. And again, and I'm sorry to belabor this point, but do you truly believe that they would go to the extent to cover up the killing of a child? I understand that they're out to get CCC and they're looking for any reason to go after opposition politicians. I remember the days when they used to beat up Changarai on the streets periodically, that sort of thing. So I understand that happens. But would they go so far as to cover up the killing of a child in order to punish you?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we've got the example of Job Sikala. The reason Honorable Job Sikala is a political prisoner and he's been in jail for 357 days is because he was the legal practitioner who represented More Blessing Ali, who was murdered by a ZANU-PF activist. And in order to cover up the investigation and the outcry that arose from the public, they decided to sway everyone's attention and to arrest Honorable Job Sikala because he was the most outspoken on the issue because it's close to his constituency. So absolutely, yes, they do this all the time. They lie all the time. But more fundamentally than that, the reason that the case is problematic, two things. Firstly, I wasn't the first person to tweet about that. It was widespread public outcry. The question that has to be asked is, a lot of journalists reported on this, a lot of citizens tweeted about this. Why did they target me? It's clear that they were targeting me because I'm an opposition voice. Secondly, Mr. Nyati's statement was only released after there was public outcry, but before any investigation had been conducted. And what's very interesting about the case is that the police officer who committed the act of violence was never brought to book. Instead, they arrest people who were tweeting condemning police brutality. What kind of a government that's acting constitutionally behaves like that? No investigation was carried out. And in fact, if you listen to the testimony of the police officer who came, he wasn't even at the scene. Their witness, their star witness, was not at the scene at all. He came to the scene 4 days later, according to his evidence. Now, how can you take those sort of trial proceedings seriously in those circumstances? Anyone who studied even a modicum of law sees all the problems, riddled with such an investigation.
And no doubt you have studied more than a modicum of law. And it's a good opportunity for me to ask you about your studies at Cambridge University, your time in the UK, and then you decided to go back to Zimbabwe. So no doubt it sharpened your tools as a legal practitioner, as somebody who practices the law. You got an education, but beyond that, did it change you much as a person?
I came out of the womb knowing I wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, I've known for a very long time. And I did my qualifying law degree at the University of Zimbabwe. And I think it's at that time that some of my values around justice and constitutionalism in particular were formed. During the period that I was in university, it was at the height of, the enactment of a series of problematic legislation. It was also at the height of the Mugabe era in terms of indigenization, the land reform program. And so I formed very clear views around the human rights situation, and human rights violations became rife. And so when I was at the University of Zimbabwe is when I think my views around human rights in particular were honed. And by the time I got to Cambridge, I'd worked in The Hague, worked on a lot of international law issues. And so it was really just to sort of, it was the frosting over, my my legal understanding. But I think some of the key foundations were definitely at the University of Zimbabwe.
Give Zimbabweans some hope in the last couple of minutes of this program. For those who have lived through hyperinflation, a lot of economic troubles, social troubles, as you mentioned at the top, many having to leave the country, go to South Africa and other countries. Tell me why they should have some hope ahead of these elections.
So, as I've said time and again, we would not risk our lives and our freedom if we didn't sincerely believe that change was possible in Zimbabwe. And on the 23rd of August, 2023, Zimbabweans have a very unique opportunity to complete the mission of liberation and vote. And we have to vote decisively, overwhelmingly for change. We need a big win. Of course, the odds are, slightly skewed against us, but that doesn't stop citizens from making their voice heard. And when apathy wins, ZANU-PF wins. The best campaign manager for ZANU-PF is apathy. So as citizens, we simply don't have the luxury of being apathetic or standing back as we approach this election, because we all know that the missing part of the equation when it comes to Zimbabwe's success is the leadership matrix. And so we have to change this once and for all. We can't keep going round and round in circles as a country. We need to resolve this so that we've got a government for once that is able to just create an ecosystem where we can thrive. Zimbabweans are extremely industrious, smart, very resourceful and resilient, citizens. And so they don't need much in order to get on with it. They just need a government that won't be, infringing upon their rights at every turn, violating property rights and making life difficult. We just want to be governed correctly, have ethical leaders. And once we do that, once we install that, our fortunes will change dramatically. And once again, we'll be known as the jewel of Africa.
Fadzayi Mahere, it's been really good to get to know you a little bit better.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for this interview. I wish you all the best.
Thank you.